we are looking at chapter 27. And this one talked about liberalism in chapter 26. Now we're going to talk about the swing toward conservatism. And so this is 1968 to 1980. And in this chapter, we're going to cover Nixon, war and diplomacy from about 1969 to 1974, Nixon and politics, again the same time period, 69 through 74, the presidency of Jimmy Carter from 76 to 80, the persistence of liberalism in the 1970s, and then we're going to end on the new right rises. So let's talk about the election of 1968 and how we get to Nixon. So the year 1968, there was a lot going on in the United States. The Orangeburg Massacre at South Carolina State University, Google that if you've never heard of that before. There's a couple of really good Google clips from some of the people that participated in it was just a protest that ended in a massacre, a shooting of students. And this is at Columbia University, and it followed student protests. And then we also have that same year the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., Robert Kennedy, and the beatings of demonstrators outside the Democratic National Convention by the Chicago police officers. And this all illustrated this mounting sense of frustration with both the status quo and the activities of protesters. The sense of dissatisfaction was not confined to the U.S. borders, however, and so predominantly young protesters in places like Paris and Czechoslovakia, Poland, Yugoslavia, Italy, Spain, Japan, even in Mexico, really demonstrated against oppressive governments and inadequate education systems. So Richard Nixon, he's running with all this kind of in the background, turmoil both inside and outside of the United States. And when he runs for president, he's running against Herbert Humphrey. That was Lyndon B. Johnson's vice president. And segregationist Alabama Governor George Wallace, who sought to create a broad coalition of supporters ranging from traditional Republicans to Democrats who were frustrated with the continuing protests in the United States. And so part of his campaign strategy was to highlight, law and order, all this unrest, all these protests, everything that's going on. What I'm going to highlight is bringing law and order back, which was a subtle way of saying he would stamp out black militancy. He also appealed to racial biases by promising to rein in civil rights enforcement and stop busing to force school integration. Nixon's appeal to moderate and conservative whites, along with his promise to end the war in Vietnam, really, that's what's going to propel him to victory, though none of the candidates won a majority of the vote. Nixon's election signaled a shift in power from the new left to the new right in American political culture, and began over 2 decades of this conservative leadership in the United States. So when I just said that none of the candidates won a majority of the vote, there was actually 3, not just 2. So let's look at that real quick. So here's Nixon. He wins 43.4%. You can tell not a huge difference, like 500,000 votes. There's all the difference right there between he and Humphrey. Humphrey gets 42.7, and George Wallace, that segregationist who wants to keep everything segregated, that guy, he got 13.5% of the popular vote. So we got Nixon in office, and we're still dealing with the Vietnam War. And so though he had promised to end the war in Vietnam, the process of doing so, it proved to be really challenging. He inaugurated a strategy known as Vietnamization, in which American troops would gradually turn over responsibility for fighting the war to the South Vietnamese. And although Nixon was attempting to reduce the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam, the American military continued to act aggressively in other ways, as Nixon ordered a secret bombing operation against Cambodia to attempt to rid that nation of Viet Cong support networks. Nixon had U.S. forces invade Cambodia in April of 1970 after the bombing campaign failed, but the U.S. military presence destabilized the nation and propelled the violent and oppressive Khmer Rouge into power. The United States, we also end up invading Laos with not a whole lot of success. Then in December of 1972, Nixon ordered an 11-day bombing campaign that pushed the North Vietnamese government to seek an opportunity for peace. An accord is signed. It's signed in early 1973, giving the United States a sense of achieving peace with honor. By 1975, however, the North Vietnamese had captured the South and implemented communist rule. So this is, I keep talking about the failure. But this is also one of those moments where it shows that we, are fighting communism and we lose this battle against communism. By the end of the conflict, we had lost 58,000 soldiers. South Vietnam forces had suffered 215,000 casualties, and the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong had lost 1 million soldiers, and roughly 4 million North and South Vietnamese civilians had lost their lives. The anti-war movement continued at home and picked up momentum when Nixon made it more difficult for American men to avoid the draft. The invasion of Cambodia also spurred widespread student demonstrations, the most famous of which was the protest at Kent State University, where 4 students were killed by the National Guard. In 1971, the New York Times and the Washington Post printed a classified report known as the Pentagon Papers, which stated that the Kennedy and Johnson administrations had lied to the public about the purposes of the Vietnam War. The publication of the report led to the 1973 passage of the War Powers Act, which required the president to consult with Congress about various aspects of war conduct. If you will recall, going back to World War II, Roosevelt had been given power to supersede Congress when it came to war-making decisions. They had almost made him like a dictator in that respect. So now what we see Congress doing is trying to take back some of that power that they had given previous presidents in these decisions and having more of a group decision made, not just a decision by the president alone. This is the fall of Saigon in 1975. You should have a map. So go through and read more about the fall, read the significance about this. Nixon attempted to ease some Cold War tensions. So we've lost that Cold War battle in Vietnam, but he positioned himself as a pragmatist, in foreign affairs, emphasizing a balance of power over the effort to achieve a clear U.S. triumph over the Soviet Union. The People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union were key targets for Nixon's efforts to ease tensions, in part because of their potential influence over North Vietnam. Nixon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger secretly planned a presidential visit to China in 1972, a move that laid the foundation for a new relationship between the U.S. and its communist rival. The Nixon administration also announced that it would support China's effort to join the United Nations. The budding relationship between the U.S. and China prompted Soviet Premier to invite Nixon to visit the Soviet Union in 1972, and their discussion of arms control led to the creation of the Strategic Alarms Limitation Treaty, also known as SALT I, which restricted each nation's store of the anti-ballistic missiles and halted the building of intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-based missiles for 5 years. Even with Nixon's détente efforts, the United States still preferred to support dictatorship over democracy if strategic or economic interests were at stake. The CIA overthrew the democratically elevated president, Salvador Allende, after he nationalized U.S. properties. So there's also a crisis in the Middle East and at home that we really haven't dug too much into, but the United States continued to confront problems in the Middle East. When Soviet-equipped Egypt and Syria invaded Israel on October 6, 1973, Israel used American military aid to push back the Arab invaders, prompting the Soviet Union and the United States to broker an agreement. Really all it does is it just restores the status quo, goes back to how it was before. In this context, though, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, also known as OPEC, dominated by Arab nations, placed an oil embargo on the United States as retribution for its aid to Israel, triggering a period of rising prices and increased inflation and unemployment that lasted for 7 months. OPEC is still in charge of oil and how much oil goes throughout the world. Anytime gas prices go up, it really doesn't have to do with the presidential administration. It really has to do with OPEC and what their move is, because most of our oil is coming from overseas. We're not really producing enough to run our entire country at this point. So OPEC is still pretty powerful and important even today. As you've noticed, gas prices, especially in 2022, have gone up because most of our oil is not, again, coming from the U.S. It's coming from overseas. So Nixon, his domestic policies really emphasized shrinking the size of the American government by moving away from Johnson's Great Society social programs and putting financial resources directly in the hands of the states. And his policies were not entirely in lockstep with conservative thinking, however, and in 1970 he promoted passage of the Environmental Protection Act. He established the Occupational Safety and Health Administration in 72, and he oversaw the creation of Consumer Product Safety Commission and signed off on legislation that made the advertising of cigarettes on television and radio illegal. With regard to racial issues, Nixon opposed school busing and believed that communities in upheaval would benefit from less government intervention. In part, this position was designed to pacify white conservatives and stave off a challenge from George Wallace in the 1972 election. Nixon also embraced policies that advanced the cause of African Americans, including the expansion of affirmative action programs, the encouragement of black capitalism, and the 1970 extension of the Voting Rights Act. In addition to a mix of conservative and liberal policies on race and other issues, Nixon worked to halt inflation and implement price and wage controls, which helped improve the economy in time for the 1972 election. And that's going to help him win re-election in 1972, which he easily does. And it featured strong and polarizing campaigning by Vice President Spiro Agnew, George Wallace's failed bid for the Democratic nomination that ended up with an assassination attempt, and George McGovern's own lackluster campaign. Nixon won more than 60% of the popular vote, but Democrats maintained their majority in Congress. In spite of the victory, Nixon's campaign conduct would unravel his success. So on June 17th of 1972, 5 men broke into the Democratic National Party headquarters at the Watergate Complex in Washington, D.C. So the Watergate Complex, it has like a whole bunch of offices located in there, and some men break into the headquarters for the Democratic Party. And as the investigation unfolded, it was revealed that the Committee for Re-election of the President, which had the worst acronym ever, known as CREEP, was responsible for the break-in. So those guys trying to get Nixon reelected, they were the ones that broke in. Nixon may or may not have been aware of the break-in before it happened, but he immediately starts to cover up, ordering his chief of staff to squelch a thorough investigation of the scandal in the name of national security. It's not going to go well. Nixon also promised to pay off the burglars and suggested that he would pardon them after their conviction. As the Watergate scandal unfolded, it became clear that Nixon and his administration had engaged in illegal activities prior to the 1972 campaign. So go back 1 year to 1971, a secret group of operatives known as the Plumbers, among whom were some of the Watergate burglars, was formed. The Plumbers were supposed to prevent leaks about government officials from landing in the media. One of the group's activities involved breaking into the office of a psychiatrist in an attempt to discredit him, because his name is Ellsberg, and he had leaked the Pentagon Papers. Nixon also secretly wiretapped members of his administration and members of the media. Key to unraveling the Watergate scandal and the Nixon administration misdeeds were Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward of the Washington Post, who relied on FBI official Mark Felt. Mark Felt got the nickname, back then his code name was known as Deep Throat, to provide information leaking the president to the Plumbers. As the scandal came to light, the Senate conducted televised hearings, which revealed that Nixon had taped his Oval Office conversations, and the Supreme Court ordered him to turn the tapes over to a special prosecutor. So just to give you an idea, the 5 burglars of Watergate, here they are. Those are the guys that broke into the Democratic National Office. So some of Nixon's top officials and advisors, including the Attorney General John Mitchell and others, they end up resigning, and 25 members of the Nixon administration eventually went to jail. As it grew increasingly clear that the Nixon administration had participated in unsavory and illegal political activities, and with the threat of impeachment looming, Nixon's going to resign on August 9th, 1974, ending his political career in disgrace. And the sad thing is, guys, he did all this and he didn't have to. He was probably going to win re-election. He didn't have to break in and steal secrets and wiretap and do all this stuff. So, but before he faces impeachment, before he's charged with a crime, he resigns from office. And his vice president at that time is Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford, whom Nixon had chosen to replace Spiro Agnew as vice president, He was former governor of New York. And Ford's most memorable moment as president came shortly after he took office, when he pardoned Nixon for his crimes. So Nixon will never be held responsible for breaking the law. So really, in spite of a less than noteworthy first term, Gerald Ford won the Republican presidential nomination in '76, but he was narrowly defeated by the election of Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter, he was a former Georgia governor, and he was also an outsider to Washington, kind of coming in with this clean slate, wasn't connected to the Watergate scandal, and that's what really propelled him into the spotlight and kind of helped him win the election. But economic turmoil, that's what's going to mark Carter's time in office. The OPEC nations controlled 80% of the world's oil supply, and they increased world oil prices to such a degree that gas prices more than quadrupled over the course of the 1970s. So it's high oil prices that prompted American manufacturers to move their factories to Latin America and Asia, resulting in a decline in union membership and migration of population from industrial regions to the Sun Belt. In addition to the steep upturn in gas prices, the late 1970s saw home prices double, car prices increase, consumer debt rise, inflation, stagnant wages, and rising unemployment led to a situation economists labeled as stagflation. This looks kind of familiar. I don't know if you guys remember the gas shortages that happened. Oh, this was a few years ago. We had a really bad hurricane, and some of our oil refineries here in Texas went out. We actually couldn't find any gas in Dallas for a while. But this is from the 1970s. Just they also had to limit the amount of gas that people were getting. You could only get like 2 or 3 gallons at a time. You weren't allowed to fill up your whole tank. So this is back in 1973. So American confidence in the government was very low because of stagflation, because of everything that we just talked about. And so Carter's policies really didn't have a lot of momentum. He drew ridicule for his 1977 energy plan, which he called the moral equivalent of war, and his critics termed it as meow, MEOW. That same year, Carter created the Department of Energy. And in 1978, he supported the National Energy Act, which established gas emission standards for automobiles and offered incentives for installing alternate energy systems. Carter did not support some conservative principles as well, and during his time in office, he rejected proposals for national health insurance and expensive employment programs. He also appealed to conservative proponents of free market economics by backing laws that deregulated the airline, banking, trucking, and railroad industries. His diplomatic perspective offered a departure from Nixon's pragmatism, and he placed an emphasis on human rights. And Carter refused to support dictatorships just because they were anti-communist, and stopped aid to Argentina, Uruguay, and Ethiopia. Less than ideal regimes in the Philippines, South Africa, and South Korea went unchecked, however, for national security reasons. Carter's efforts at moral leadership included an agreement to return the Panama Canal Zone to Panama, which removed a remnant of colonialism but riled conservatives in the United States. Carter also built on Richard Nixon's pursuit of détente with the Soviet Union, extending full diplomatic recognition to the People's Republic of China in 1978 and signing SALT II with the Soviet leader. Carter's efforts at détente hit an obstacle when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, however. And in response, Carter and Congress abandoned SALT II, they increased their military spending, and they boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics. Carter also authorized the CIA to arm and assist Afghan rebels, including the Holy Warriors, whose ranks included the Taliban and Saudi Arabian Islamic fundamentalist Osama bin Laden. Because previous presidents' foreign policy dealings had led to unsavory behavior, in 1975 the Senate held hearings on the CIA and FBI activities that revealed illegal domestic spying as well as efforts to encourage rebellion in other countries. Here are some of those Afghan holy warriors that we are going to supply weapons to. And as I stated before, these holy warriors included the infamous Osama bin Laden, who we will come back and talk about him later. But some of Carter's diplomatic successes included the negotiation of the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt, a peace agreement that included Egypt's diplomatic recognition of Israel and Israel's return of the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. The deal came with U.S. aid to Egypt, but did not establish a solution for the problem of Palestine. Carter ran into problems in Iran, however. Those problems stemmed from the CIA-engineered overthrow of the Iranian president in 1953 and the elevation of the Shah of Iran, Pahlavi, whose regime repressed and tortured Islamic fundamentalists. Also, his lifestyle, it was very lavish and did not reflect the vast poverty within Iran. So in 1979, Pahlavi was overthrown by Islamic fundamentalists who sought to bring the nation under the rule of strict Islamic law. So they disposed of him. He was the Shah. He was already ill with terminal cancer, and he accepted an offer from Carter to come to the United States for treatment. And in response, we're going to see Iran order Muslim students to seize the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and hold 52 hostages until the Shah was returned to Iran to stand trial. Carter's response was to freeze Iranian assets in the U.S. banks, break off diplomatic relations, and implement an embargo, but those measures did nothing to ease the crisis, free the hostages, or keep oil prices low, and in the midst of the crisis, oil prices rose 130%. So this hostage crisis is going to intensify as Carter's unsuccessful attempt to rescue the hostages prompted guards to separate them. And they're going to further mock Carter by releasing all the hostages on the day of Ronald Reagan's inauguration. So Reagan really gets the props, and he receives the congratulations for the hostages being released, but he had nothing to do with it. Carter's working tirelessly behind the scenes trying to get these hostages released and sent back to the U.S., but Reagan gets all the credit for it. So although conservatism was on the rise, the liberalism in the 1960s lingered and continued to influence mainstream culture. So we have like long hair, colorful clothes, rock music, drug use, sexual experimentation. Those were all normalized. By the end of the 1970s, sexual experimentation had resulted in the nation's divorce rate reaching an all-time high. Social movements influenced popular culture as well, with rock continuing to evolve and artists like Bruce Springsteen and Billy Joel and Jackson Browne capturing the attention of audiences. We also have films such as MASH, offered a social critique of the Vietnam War, though MASH itself was set during the Korean War. So television shows like All in the Family offered American audiences a depiction of the strife between liberals and conservatives, symbolized by Archie Bunker's offensive commentary about feminists, liberals, and religious, racial, and ethnic minorities. If you haven't seen it, do a YouTube All in the Family search and you can watch some clips, maybe even some full episodes of All in the Family. The women's movement. It achieved a victory in the Supreme Court's 1973 Roe v. Wade decision, which decriminalized abortion. This decision triggered a profound political conflict between pro-life and pro-choice forces. So whether you agree with abortion or not, it was a victory because for the first time, women had the right to decide medical decisions without the court being involved. So it's really a movement for women's right in their body. So don't think of it, you can think of it as life versus death and abortion, but really this is a step in the goal of reaching equality for women and letting women decide what happens to their bodies. Still a very hot button topic here in the United States, especially here in the South, with very conservative ideas about women's rights and control of their own body. But the National Organization for Women succeeded in winning ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment in 35 out of the necessary 38 states. But the organization is going to come into conflict with the conservative women over the amendment which prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex. And so the biggest proponent against the Equal Rights Amendment is a woman by the name of Phyllis Schlafly. And she led conservative women in their efforts establishing the Stop ERA organization, arguing that the amendment would diminish women's rights to abide by normative gender roles, live as housewives, use single-sex bathrooms, and avoid military service. And her campaign was successful, and in 1982, the Equal Rights Amendment died. We still don't have it. Women are still not seen as equal. In 1972, Congress passed the Education Amendment Act, which included Title IX, a provision preventing universities and colleges from discriminating against women, particularly in the field of athletics. The women's movement saw other victories in the 1970s, including the establishment of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which offered women the chance to fight employment discrimination, the increased presence of shelters and support organizations for victims of domestic and sexual violence, and the establishment of the National Women's Political Caucus in 1971. The number of women in Congress increased in this context also, as Shirley Chisholm, Geraldine Ferrero, Barbara Jordan, and Patricia Schroeder all won seats. Women's political organizations also gained momentum during this period. Feminism itself, though, expanded in this period as women of color sought to link racial and sex discrimination. So in 1974, Barbara Smith led a group of feminists forming a collective which really tried to articulate the ways in which racial and sexual oppression coexisted in Black women's lives specifically. We also saw a rise in environmentalism among activists who were inspired by Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which detailed the effects of pesticides like DDT on animals, plants, humans, and water. With enthusiasm for environmental change spreading across the country, Nixon established the Environmental Protection Agency, remember, back in 1971, and then signed the Clean Air Act. In 1973, Congress banned the sale of DDT. For some, environmentalism placed overly harsh restrictions and regulations on the auto industry that made it more difficult for American companies to compete with foreign car companies. The 1973 Endangered Species Act fueled a conflict between environmentalists and timber companies in the Northwest. And then in 1978, housewives near Love Canal in upstate New York complained about widespread birth defects and frequent illnesses in their community, which led to investigations that revealed they were right. There was a toxic waste site below their housing development that was seeping up and causing birth defects, and it was getting in the water. And in 1980, Congress passed the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, or Superfund. Subsequent investigations revealed that sites requiring federal intervention were most frequently found near, where do you think? African American and other minority communities. In March of 1979, the Three Mile Island nuclear plant in Pennsylvania almost experienced a meltdown, but workers diffused the situation and the area was evacuated before a crisis set in. But that incident called attention to the potential dangers of nuclear power and encouraged organizations like the Clamshell Alliance to push for a slowdown in the building of nuclear power facilities. And you can tell, I mean, look how close this nuclear plant is to this backyard where these kids are playing. And there's another house back here. So, I don't know the dog's name, but here's the dog house. So it just shows you, like, these nuclear power plants, if they were to melt down, they're going to, take out, like, kind of like Chernobyl. They're going to take out a whole city with them if that happens. So just raising awareness about the potential dangers and how we need to put in safety guards for all of these things. So the persistence, racial struggles are still continuing, though, and we do have some significant civil rights advancements that do occur in the 1960s. Civil rights and racial justice activism continued, building on the groundwork for political advancement laid by the Voting Act of 1965. By the early 1990s, there were more than 7,500 Black elected officials in the United States, with the majority of them serving at the local level, so within your cities. Though the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education 1954 mandated the desegregation of schools, the process was still really going slow 15 years later. And in 1969, the Supreme Court ruled that schools could no longer delay integration. And in 1971, Swan v. Charlotte and Mecklenburg Board of Education decision required school districts to bus students to achieve integration. The Swan decision generated controversy in the North, where neighborhood and residential segregation had resulted in segregated school districts despite the absence of Jim Crow laws. So they were already segregated. They were already like Black neighborhoods with a Black school and white neighborhoods with a white school. And what they're saying is, like, it's really hard to, like, bus students in and out of those because they already had their schools set up. So in 1974, the Supreme Court ruled that students could not be bused across school district boundaries. Here's the anti-busing march. Boston, Massachusetts all erupted in conflict when predominantly white working-class South Boston and predominantly black Roxbury were paired for busing, sparking violence in and around the schools and protests outside the federal building in downtown Boston. In addition to school integration, though, through busing, affirmative action was an important issue in the 1970s, and it saw successes in doubling the number of African Americans in college and narrowing the income gap between African Americans and whites. Still, about 1/3 of African Americans experienced increasing poverty over the course of the decade. Whites resisted affirmative action, calling it reverse discrimination, and suggesting that whites suffered as a result of such policies, even though income inequality told a very different story and proved them wrong. The debate over affirmative action programs continued for 30 years as its opponents succeeded in gradually chipping away at them. Let's talk about the new right and rising, and then we'll think we're almost done with this chapter. So the 1970s saw the growth of a right-wing revival that was fueled by high taxes, frustration with the government, liberal defectors, and a growth in Christian conservatism. In addition, the white middle class expressed its approval of black power, hippies, the anti-war movement, and feminism. Taxes were an important rallying point for the new right, as many Americans were frustrated with the level of state and federal taxes they paid. In 1978, California voters approved Proposition 13, which reduced property taxes and created hurdles for municipalities looking to raise them. Supply-side economics advocated lowering taxes, theorizing that an increase in available money would lead to an increase in hiring and therefore in the number of Americans who paid taxes, right? You pay taxes on things like they take taxes out of your paycheck. More people, more taxes. More people working, more taxes going in. They also supported cuts in government spending, particularly on social programs. This is the tax revolt that we were just talking about in 1978. So you can see tax on this home up 300%. This is based on new assessed value. So every year you can go down, and your parents probably are more familiar with this, you can go down and protest tax increase on your property, but property taxes do increase yearly. My property taxes are insane because I live in Dallas County compared to like here in Lamar County or Hunt County, where yours are relatively lower than mine. But neoconservatives such as Nathan Glazer and some others, they shifted away from liberal policies they had once supported in favor of fighting affirmative action, the new left, and the anti-war movement. So we do have some of that on the rise. But we also have Christian conservatism, and this is a significant portion of the new right was made up of these socially conservative Christians and Catholics that included the head of the Stop ERA campaign and evangelicals who believed that they had been born again. About 1/4 of the U.S. population identified themselves as evangelical Christians by the end of the 1970s, and this group ventured into politics to fight abortion, sex education, gay rights, and the ban on prayer in schools and support traditional gender roles and the teaching of creationism in schools. Family structure changed in the 1970s, raising concerns for the Christian right. By the end of the decade, the percentage of nuclear family households was declining and divorces on the rise, while the number of couples living together without being married grew rapidly, as did the number of children born to single mothers. Many conservative evangelicals were prompted to enter the political arena when the Internal Revenue Service removed the tax-exempt status from the fundamentalist Christian college. The college had begrudgingly admitted black students but continued to practice discriminatory policies against them. And when the IRS revoked their funding, because you can't do that, if you want government funding, you have to follow government rules. So the college claimed that the agency was interfering with religious freedom, sparking a grassroots political campaign to rally Christian evangelicals. They were not going against religious freedom. The IRS was challenging their discrimination against minorities. Had nothing to do with the religion, but it was against your discriminatory practices. But they claimed it was religious freedom. So what we see in the 1970s and 1980s, an increasing number of evangelical preachers found a home on television. Pat Robertson founded the Christian Broadcasting Network, and ministers used television to spread their message, which often combined religion and politics. In 1979, Falwell founded the Moral Majority, a lobbying organization that supported politicians who embraced conservative Christian values. So what we're going to look at in chapter 28 is the triumph of conservatism. So we will see that the conservatives do win out by the end of the this decade, we're going to look at the end of the Cold War and a rise of the New World Order. So we made it through the 60s and 70s. We're now going to be slowly moving into the 80s and the 90s.